Are you concerned about the fate of our beautiful planet? When you see the wildfires, the droughts, the hurricanes, are you worried about global warming and climate change? If so, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to talk to Dennis Kiley. He's the founder of the Eco Psychology Initiative. He has been working in this field for many years, and he's here to share some of his wisdom with us today. We'll be talking about different techniques that you can use to cope with the ecological situation that we find ourselves in and to begin to take some action if you haven't already. We'll be talking about a technique he calls face, feel, and flow. We'll be talking about the eagle perspective and the ant perspective. And we'll be getting into the roots of the ecological crisis, which he terms ego consciousness. So I'm so excited to have him here today. Today, in Resilience in Dark Times, drawing upon the wisdom of nature, Eco Psychology with Dennis Kiley. You're listening to Resilience in Dark Times. I'm your companion and guide, Michael Glavin. Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you found us. This is a space for honest conversation, practical strategies, and the kind of hope that comes from facing reality together. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you're here. Today, this is episode number 21, if you can believe it. And this is our first video podcast. So if you're on Apple or Spotify, don't worry about it. You're not going to miss anything. But if you're on YouTube or Substack, then you'll be able to see me and Dennis in person talking through these issues. So if you're curious as to what we look like and want to see some visuals, go on over to YouTube or Substack. Otherwise, just settle in and listen to this episode of this podcast. Today, we're going to be looking at eco psychology with Dennis Kiley, who is the founder of the Eco Psychology Initiative. He not only has done that, I've known him for many years and respect him greatly. I consider him a cherished friend and an inspiration to me, and especially in these dark times in relationship to nature and the natural world and psychological insights and a deep wisdom. So let me introduce him formally. Dennis Kiley is a mental health counselor in private practice in Bar Harbor, Maine. He also started and runs an organization called the Eco Psychology Initiative, where he integrates the principles of nature and psychology to foster healing, health, and resilience. He works with individuals and groups, organizations, and communities, offering programs on subjects like climate psychology, ecotherapy, and leadership. On behalf of the Maine Climate Council, he helped lead the working group presenting on and making suggestions for cultivating statewide initiatives for building psychological resilience in the face of climate changes. He also was one of the founders of a small nonprofit, A Climate to Thrive, which started with the goal of energy independence by 2030 for his island and has grown into a statewide leader on building community-driven, equitable climate solutions. As part of this work, he oversaw initiatives to install over $250,000 worth of electric vehicle charging stations in rural Maine. He lives amidst the mountains, woods, and waters of Acadia National Park on Mount Desert Island, Maine. Without further ado, my good friend and amazing human being, Dennis Kiley. Dennis, it's so good to see you. Welcome. I'm so glad to have you on Resilience in Dark Times as our first guest speaker. And you're here for a really important topic to talk about what's happening ecologically in the planet and eco-psychology and what eco-psychology has to offer people. So why don't you first tell us what eco-psychology is?
Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. First off, I'm honored to be invited to be on this with you, who's a friend. But I can also say, remove from that perspective, that you are offering a really wonderful podcast and resources to the world that really is needed right now. And it's so substantive. So I'm all the more privileged to be here. And I'm glad to hear that you and your community think that looking at the planetary crisis that we're facing is a really important thing for both understanding and addressing not only that ecological disaster that we're facing, but also nurturing greater resilience. And so I do think that eco psychology has something important to offer, and looking forward to being part of the conversation with you. I would say that eco psychology can be a lot of different things. Like, the historical origins was a man named Theodore Roszak in the 80s. Uh, coined the term. He wasn't the only one talking about it, but the intention was to bring ecology into psychology in our understandings of ourselves and our communities and a lot of the psychological dynamics. And the other side of it was to bring psychology into better addressing environmentalism, which was even something then. And so I think those roots are relevant for talking about current context. And I think it's still very applicable of, in order to understand psychological issues, we need to consider ecological components, and to better address some of these poly crises, including the climate, that we do need to bring in more psychology. And so that, I would just say, as a little as a backdrop, I personally engage with eco psychology in a couple of different ways. One is helping people to get the most from their time outside. And so I call that as a broad umbrella ecotherapy. And there's a lot of research into the benefits of time out of doors. And so I work with people individually, but also train educators and clinicians and healthcare professionals how they can bring that work to their clients. I also work in this field of climate psychology. And so that might be mental health and climate change. That might be communication and leadership. It might be, how do we foster greater psychological resilience in the face of what's happening? And so I think all of those are areas that I feel really fortunate and passionate to be involved in. And I think can contribute to this conversation that you're having about fostering resilience in dark times.
Yeah, it's such important work, especially now. So I'm really curious, why eco psychology for you, right? Like, what in particular about it drew you to it?
It came more from experience that I found on a personal basis, that I was just happier and healthier and more resilient the more time I spent outside. And I got really curious to understand more of the research. And then additionally, as a therapist and a teacher and a trainer, I was discovering that my clients and my students were having significantly more meaningful and transformative experiences when nature was either at the forefront of the service or the program I was offering, or in the backdrop in the context with where we were. So it really started as a curiosity of, like, what is this all about? And the more that I did a deep dive into it, realized that there was a lot of research and information that supported this. And then I guess the final piece is, I, like maybe many of your community members, were feeling a lot of pain in my heart about what's
Mm,
happening with our planet, and was like, well, what do I need to do to cultivate more resilience? As well as, how do we become more effective at bringing about change in really practical behavioral terms? And my background in psychology seemed like it could have something to contribute for not only working hard, but working smart and a little more effectively.
hmm That's great. Um, so I'm really curious about, how do you frame the current crisis, right? Do you talk about, global warming, climate change? Because I know I've been aware of the ecological situation for a while now. And for me, it's always been too overwhelming to really think about. The more I look at the science, the more overwhelmed I get. It's easy to just shut down, push it away, hope that it changes or something happens. And, I've been active at various points to try to do something, but it can be so overwhelming for people. So how do you think about our current ecological crisis?
Well, I think it's one of many polycrises that we face that
Mm,
are part of a much larger meta crisis. And in that way, I think it's helpful because they're interdependent. So in working in one area, maybe it's mental health or it's housing instability, or in climate change, like they're all mutually supporting this larger, what I would call a crisis of consciousness. And we can look at a lot of the surface manifestations of these crises, and whether we call it capitalism or climate change or the destruction of our political democracies or social and economic inequalities. I mean, all of those are valid causes, but I would say in some ways they are also symptoms of an underlying collective cultural consciousness that we have that has really valued a story of separation. And
Mhm.
from that story of separation, we see that we can do a whole host of real horrors and injustices to other people. And so in my work, I'd say two things. One, I don't feel attached to the language that's used. I think it's really important that everyone finds their own framework and language that works for them. And my need then is to adapt to meet them accordingly. But I am continually curious of like what's at the roots of the issue, what's at the wellspring, so to speak. And I think in my work, I talk about it as what I call ego consciousness. And it's a series of underlying principles that I think have psychologically spread and infiltrated our whole society. And you could think of that as fear and scarcity, control and reductionism. I think there's an effort at like striving and producing. We value the little self, the ego, the I, me, my, as
Mhm.
opposed to this much larger web of belonging and interdependence. In one of your recent podcasts, you talk about it as interbeing. Like, I think we've
Mhm.
really forgotten who we are and instead gotten kind of caught up in some of the traps of modernity and Western thinking that has really led us astray. And so when I'm working with people, I'm really trying to get at like the roots of those. One, because I think it's, as I said, it's the kind of the wellspring, but that's where we actually have agency to make a difference. Is that if I see, whether it's in my own life or in my family or my work environment or community, that there's a real pervasive narrative around fear or scarcity, or we're objectifying other people, or there's a lot of waste. Well, now all of a sudden I feel like I have a capacity to make a difference and take an action that not only benefits me, but it benefits my local environment and community, which I think is so critically important.
Great. Yeah, yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of I think it's so fundamental to the way humans relate to each other and relate to nature. And I really like what you're saying about the ego, the small self, and then because the small self is so vulnerable, and so we're scared, and we need resources, and so and that misses the larger interconnection. Yeah, I really like that. So
Yeah.
I want to get into, in a moment, how you work with people. What techniques have you seen that really help people? But before we get into that, what are you seeing? How is the sort of environmental crisis, ecological crisis affecting people? Because I think it's affecting people on two levels. One is the lived experience, right? It's 70 degrees in January in Chicago, and like that's nice, but we know that's not right. It's not supposed to be that warm in January. Or there's wildfires just burning out of control in the Pacific Northwest or in Canada. So there's that specific experience of the sort of the environmental crisis, but there's also the knowledge of, oh, we know about the bleaching of the coral reefs and the death of that, and et cetera, et cetera. So I know this is affecting people. There's, the eco anxiety term. And so what are you seeing? How is it affecting individuals?
Yeah, you're right, Michael. And I think we being of the privileged Western society, which is not to make light of the many people who are suffering, but for many of us, it's the effects of climate change are coming much later, as
Mhm.
opposed to those in other parts of the world that are less privileged and fortunate. They've already started to be raising this alarm and well aware of it. And now all of a sudden, for example, I live on the coast of Maine, and when there are two major storms that have caused billions of dollars of damage
Mhm.
in just one winter, now all of a sudden people are waking up and they can no
Right.
longer attribute it to other things. And so it's both tragic that this is having a real meaningful impact in people's livelihoods and where they're living and quality of life. But it also now is, I think, bringing a greater awareness, at least in some communities and where I live, that this needs our attention. In terms of other impacts, I'm in my work seeing it a lot around the mental health impacts. And those are really significant. And I don't know if statistics are useful, but I'll just share a couple of
Sure,
things here.
yeah.
We know from the American Psychological Association that 20% of the American populace suffers from some type of mental health diagnosis. And
Mm,
they've already come out and said that climate change is exacerbating the symptoms and the experiences of those, to say nothing of increasing the onset. And then for the other 80% of our population, they can directly attribute and causally say that climate change is causing increases in anxiety, PTSD, depression, addiction, suicidal ideation, violence, anger and
mhm,
aggression, while at the same time eroding social cohesion. And so this is real. And now there's starting to be some research that's come out from some major natural disasters. And they are
mhm.
finding that after a major natural disaster, 54% of the people affected will have some type of depressive experience. And
Wow.
after those hurricanes, for example, Hurricane Maria or Hurricane Harvey, they were a number of years ago,
Mhm.
25 to 66% of the population had PTSD symptoms. So
Wow.
there is real impact that's having for a lot of people, not only who experience it, but are just informed and aware of the nature of the crisis. And so I really try and emphasize to people like, there's nothing wrong with you. Like, if anything, it's a testament that you care and you're aware of the issue and that you can feel into your heart. While at the same time, how do we get some resources to support people being resilient and navigating this really turbulent terrain?
Right. Yeah, I think that point is that there's nothing wrong with you. That this is, if you're feeling pain of the what's happening, that's good. You're supposed to, right? And so the temptation then is for people to shut that down or shut that off. And we as psychotherapists don't want people to do that. What do we want them to do instead? What are the
Yeah,
interventions that you find really help people?
Yeah, so I have a number of ones, and I want to just use this as another opportunity to just highlight this podcast because I teach a lot on resilience in my work. And so often I'm like, I listen to different talks or programs. I'm like, oh, I would have added that or this. And yours is really comprehensive. So some of this might be reiterating for your community because you've already done a great job touching on it. But to me, I think about dividing it into a number of sections. One being the mental is understanding what are people's stories that they're telling about themselves and the world around them, and often trying to reframe that narrative into something affirmative. So instead of there's something wrong with me because I'm struggling to get out of bed, given what's happening in the world, well, we can reframe that narrative of like, well, wow, you actually really care. You're in touch with your heart and what's happening, and that you're feeling moved by that. And it doesn't mean we want them to necessarily stay in that place, but a lot of times it's the shame and it's the internalized
Mhm.
judgment that just adds this added layer of suffering that just can make resilience so much harder. So oftentimes bringing attention to what are these stories? Are they actually true? Because a lot of times we can be so critical. I come upon the work of Rick Hansen and taking in the good and how important it is for people to give themselves some credit. So we tend to be in this dualistic frame of like, oh, if I didn't do all my goals for the day, or if I didn't do X, Y, and Z perfectly, well, then it wasn't good enough. Well, in this
Mhm.
both and framework of like, I can give myself credit for trying, or that I did get dressed and got up and went outside, right? Like that
Mhm.
counts for something, even if it may not have been your standards. I'll get to a couple of eco-psychological approaches in a moment.
Mhm.
Mindfulness is just, there's so much research on it. And that's really convenient for being outdoors because there's research has shown that they mutually benefit each other. When it comes to the emotions, I have a little slogan I use, which is face, feel, and flow.
Mhm.
And a lot of times we don't want to face it in the first place.
Nope.
And then once we do face it and acknowledge, like, oh, I'm really sad or I'm scared or confused, we don't
Mhm.
then want to feel it.
Mhm.
And then I think the third part, though, is that a lot of us, when we do feel, we can get stuck in it. And so
Mhm.
having strategies for flowing with it, kind of thinking about water, of letting it flow through. I think physical health is so important. So, like nutrition and
Mhm.
exercise and sleep, relationally. I mean, you do a great job just by nature of this podcast. We need to be talking about it. And for some
Yeah.
people, that's in a group. Some people that's with their therapist. Some people that's just one-on-one with another person. But it's so important for us and for others that we're really communicating about this. Um, I think having boundaries, you talked about technology in one of your podcasts. Like, I think
Hmm.
it's important people have the self-awareness to know what is it that works for me in terms of technology or news or media and what doesn't. And sometimes it's appropriate to say no, like, I can't read one more article. I can't have this next conversation. Or, you know what? I'm feeling really down, but I can't spend another hour on YouTube.
Hmm.
Um, and so now just to cycle into a couple of things eco-psychologically that I try and incorporate. One is get outside. There's a researcher named Matthew White who says that just 2 hours a week has long-term benefit for our mental health. If you are listeners are interested, there's a ton of research about how beneficial it is for our well-being and resilience to be outside. Even just looking at out a window and being able to see nature has been shown to have impacts, to say nothing of these 2 hours a week.
Hmm.
We know from the American Environmental Protection Agency that the average American only spends 7% of their time outside.
Hmm.
And like, that's doubly tragic, right? Like, our planet is being plundered and pillaged at a time where we're less connected to it in really practical terms.
Yeah.
Um, Another one here, this I think straddles the ecological and the psychological, is I would say that some of the very conditions of life, be those ecological or human or otherwise, are complexity and uncertainty, change and interconnectedness. Like, I think that characterizes any type of ecosystem, be
All
that
right. All
one
right.
in
Slow down.
nature,
So complexity,
uncertainty,
uncertainty, change.
change, and
Yeah.
interconnectedness.
Great. Yeah.
And I think it is often our suffering is when we try and resist those things, when
Mm.
we move toward, we don't want to embrace that things are complex and that they're changing and that we can't possibly know them. And it's a lot of our coping in reaction to that
Mm.
that causes so much suffering.
Yeah. It reminds me, I read an interview with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he was being asked about global warming and climate change. And he, on the one hand, had sort of this, you could tell a deep love for the creatures of the earth and the people of the earth. But he talked also about, we don't know what's going to happen. And he had this perspective of, the dinosaurs came and they went, and, maybe humans will arise and then go away, but maybe someone or people will change. And he had this such a long-term perspective of just the transience of the ephemeral nature of life. And if you step back enough, it's like, oh, okay, like that it shifts you out of the fighting against it, right? And opens up then the compassion, the love, the taking action, but it's just an acceptance of, yeah, this is happening and I can't stop it at the global level. And at the global level, the sun's going to burn out and everything's going to go anyway. So
Yeah.
it just, that perspective, I think, really helps cope in the day to day.
Yeah, exactly. I think it reminds us how much of a gift that life is, and that life is fleeting and precious. And so each moment, each breath, each tree we see, each, hug from a child or sunset or just casual moment of an eye glance with a stranger on the street, like, those moments are sacred. And when we can really drop into them, those have the capacity to be incredibly healing. And I think of, I use this in eco psychology. I talk about the eagle perspective and the ant perspective, and it kind of fits this both and the eagle perspective is the really large context of where we are. And that might be big time, as you were just talking about. It might be like, oh, wow, we're going through profound upheaval politically and socially right now. And sometimes having that larger perspective of the eagle, so to speak, can be really helpful to contextualize the moment. But then we also need the ant perspective, which is in the moment. It's right here. It's right now, that this small act of self-care, or this holding the door for the stranger, or this talking about it with a friend, or these very small, which at times can seem inconsequential can be really profoundly important for the big picture outcomes that we want.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. The eagle perspective and the ant perspective. That's great. I'm going to steal
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, please do. I mean, it fits
Yeah.
my favorite eco-psychological principle is both and.
Yeah.
And we are so
Yeah.
prone to the either or binary dualistic. And it's like, no, two things are true at the same time.
So let's get in a little bit more specifically into eco psychology, specific ways of working with this. I know you've talked about biomimicry, and that as a psychological term. Can you go into that? And what is that all about?
Well, I love that you brought that up. And for listeners, you won't know, but I've got a big grinning smile right now because this is this area of eco psychology that I'm really passionate about. And I've come up with this term called psychological biomimicry. And to step back, though, biomimicry is rooted in the term of biomimetics, which means imitating the principles of life. And so if we start from this notion that we are part of this larger world and that that is also within us, then we see that, okay, we're part of nature, nature's a part of us, and that it's like, how do we live according to these principles of life? Um, and I think that's one way of framing. We can also just think about it from like ecosystems, that we're an ecosystem. And why don't we adopt some of these core tenets that the natural world has shown leads to qualities that we want, like resilience and health and healing and regeneration and sustainability? So biomimetics is really trying to mimic and adopt some of these core ecological designs and principles and processes. And it's been used in a lot of different areas. So think about using the owl's wing to design an airplane wing, or gecko's feet to improve suction on different types of products. It's been used for energy infrastructure. I joke, I mean, it's not a joke, but it's humorous to me that in 2021, Fortune magazine called biomimicry one of the top 5 trends to follow. Um, so
That's
in that
great.
way, it's become more mainstream, but I'm interested in how do we do this psychologically? Of how do we take some of these core principles, think like diversity or adaptation? How do we incorporate these psychologically into our lives for both better understanding what's happening, but then also really intentionally applying some of these principles into our lives in practical ways? And so think about adaptation. Well, if we're going through a hard time right now, how do we adapt our behaviors? How do we adapt the way we're thinking about things? And I would say a lot of times, a lot of ways people struggle with resilience is we're not adapting.
Mm.
Um, or so, for example, there's also qualities. One of my favorite ones is instinct. That we know that part of what enables animals and organisms, and the more research we're finding on trees and plants, is that they even have instinct of like what enables them to thrive and survive and even evolve is that they listen, are attuned to that instinct. And I think as humans, we're so caught up in our left brains, we're caught up outside of ourselves for answers and information that we've lost touch with the most wise teacher we possibly can have, which is our own inner knowing, our own intuition. And so I really am advocating for anyone I work with of like, do what it takes to get in touch with that instinct. Or you've talked about it in your podcast, but purpose. Like any type of ecosystem has a type of purpose. And I think a lot of times we feel adrift, but if we can have a sense of purpose and intentionality, it can make such a difference. Um, Also understanding that like life moves in cycles, and sometimes the cycle is hardship. Sometimes the season is winter, so to speak, and it's hunker down, and that's there. And okay, we need to adapt. And I think if we look globally, politically right now, like we're in dark times, and that is a season, and so we need to shift accordingly. So that's this example of psychological biomimicry, how it could be used to both better understand where we are and what's maybe causing struggle or suffering, as well as how do we apply some of these teachings and principles in a way into our life that could really benefit us for not only resilience, but I think then this other area is taking action. because as you've talked about, it's wonderful that we do self-care and that we're taking care of ourselves and talking with friends, but I think it's important to bring it forward into the world. And there's research that says that people felt more resilient as well as their mental health had improved when they were doing things in their community. And let's be honest, we're in a bit of a mess. We're in a huge mess. It's not a little bit of a mess. We're in a huge mess right now. And we need
Yeah.
everyone to do something. No one can do everything, but everyone can do something of picking up that shovel and finding some area of purpose and passion where you can give in a way that feels generative for you and your community and the planet.
Do you have some examples of that? Like, yeah, what would, I know it's very different depending on, who the person is and where they are and their abilities and their work schedule and all of that stuff. But what are some things that you would recommend in terms of some examples of things people can do to take action?
Yeah, Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson has a great way of talking about of finding where your passions and your skills and the needs of your community overlap.
Mm,
And I think it's important to note passions because if it feels depleting,
mm,
then we're not going to stick with it and it's not going to be a joyous process.
mm.
But I'll give you two stories of my own life.
Great.
One was 10 years ago. I was living in this Acadia National Park, Mount Desert Island, Maine, and a group of us in the community were just really distressed by what was happening even then. And we didn't have answers, but we said, we're just going to start by hosting potlucks.
Mm,
And it was something really simple. It was five of us started hosting potlucks of people coming together. Fast forward, that became a nonprofit that
mm.
is now a statewide leader in equitable community driven climate solutions and has gotten national recognition. And it started with a couple of us having potlucks and bringing people together.
That is so awesome. I love that. Yeah, because once people get
Yeah,
together, you don't know where it's going to go, right?
exactly.
Yeah, I love Hannah Arendt, and I'm paraphrasing as her definition of politics as people coming together to create the future, to shape the future, right? And once they come together, no one knows what's going to happen. They bring something new into the world. So that's a great example. It's just people, we're just going to have a potluck, right? We have some similar feelings and orientation, and it turns into this amazing thing. That's, oh, I love it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in that, there's something around connection and community, it's service. But as you said, it's also being open to what wants to unfold and letting it
Mhm.
take a life of its own. Another example is the state of Maine created what's called a climate council. And it was trying to come up with all these initiatives and recommendations and funding for climate action. And it had started in 2020, and I was following along peripherally and noticed that there was nothing around mental health. And so I reached out to a couple of the council members. You can go online. I found their email address and I said, hey, could I just talk with you? And I mean, it may have helped that I have the position and the role that I do and the work that I do, but I really think they were just open. And I was able to, I was shared some statistics and information of like, hey, it's going to be really important that you're looking at psychological resilience and mental health in the face of what's happening with climate change. Well, all of a sudden I get invited to be a part of one of their working groups on resilience. I lead the initiatives with some help around cultivating psychological resilience and mental health. And now all of a sudden the state of Maine has created all these different proposals and funding sources for community groups to have access towards resources for resilience and mental health. And
Wow.
I'm not someone special. I was just willing to
Mhm.
make some emails and use my voice and then show up for some meetings and all of a sudden and joining with others. Because like I said, it wasn't just me. I had taken the
Right.
lead, but there were others who all of a sudden were um, spearheading it and offering great roles and responsibility as well.
Yeah, I feel like the time is right. The people like are wanting to do something. Sometimes it just takes one person speaking out and starting something in motion, and the people are there with the energy and the passion and the resources, and it can really catch quickly, right?
Mm-hmm. And
Wow.
unfortunately, the trade-off to this upheaval that we're going through is it's causing incredible suffering. But
Mhm.
from a systemic perspective, it's at these times of disruption that there's the most opportunity for change.
Right. Right.
And so people, and it doesn't have to be our goal, but just starting in our community and our families and just doing one little thing, and like a seed, it can
Hmm.
spread.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So, anything else about eco psychology that we didn't cover that you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I guess one other thing I would offer in this vein of psychological biomimicry is you've talked about the power of story, and I love that you
Hmm.
incorporate it. Well, I think there's also a power as part of that in metaphors.
Hmm.
Um, and I think it's something that our brains can relate to as well as our psyches and our hearts. And I think those metaphors can be really transformative for making sense of what's happening, but also giving us inspiration. And so I'll give you an example of one of how certain seeds need fire to regenerate.
Hmm.
And so if we think of that like quite literally, but also metaphorically in ourselves of like going through these hardships, this fiery time, what seeds in me want to be germinated?
Hmm. I love
Right.
that.
And so, I mean, that's one that offers context, but there's a number of other metaphors, and people can find their own either directly related to resilience or just someplace that they have a really close relationship, maybe like gardening, that
Hmm.
these experiences and these metaphors can offer really tangible maps and guidance for navigating hard times and moving forward.
Yeah, I love that because it gives sort of meaning to the suffering, right? It's like, oh,
Exactly.
okay, maybe this is important. Maybe it'll awaken something in me, in us, that will then come forth, right? It's not just meaningless, it's not purposeless, that we can make good use of the suffering, that we can make this into something. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, as you've done wonderfully well, and I'm reiterating here of like the importance of those stories. And
Yeah.
sometimes, given that we are a part of nature and just that it's a backdrop for so many of us, those nature metaphors and those nature stories, we feel ourselves in them. And it
Mm,
gives that meaning, and it gives a sense of purpose from which we can then also find some inspiration to keep going.
I love it. Yeah. Yeah, when you're talking about biomimicry, like looking to nature, right, to learn about what we need to do in this moment and to draw some wisdom from looking at nature, which, can be seen as a projection of our own internal wisdom onto nature, right, that we're then taking up and acting on, but we're part of nature. So it's the projection, but it is us too, right? Because it's all one thing. So yeah, I really love
Yeah.
that concept. And
Well, and if I could just leave you with this here is that maybe as a practice for your audience members,
mm,
um, is to go out into the natural world and just maybe you start with a really broad question of like, what can I learn from nature today?
mm,
Or what in the natural world is speaking to me? And see,
mm,
maybe um, it's a particular animal or it's a metaphor or something. And sometimes it might be a question. And people
mm,
can go the same biomimicry of like going with something very specific of like, what do I need that will help me feel more resilient? And kind of like dropping a pebble in water of like just see what happens and holding it loosely but go in really openly,
mm.
and see what comes back, because there's the natural world is continually providing wisdom, and I would like to say it's in relationship with us. And so if we're open to that, we can get a lot of really practical information that we can use to benefit ourselves.
I love it. I love that action item for today for our listeners. That is so great.
Yeah.
So, if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to work with you, I know you do life coaching, I know you do therapy. So, if they're in Maine, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I would encourage people to go to the website of this organization I lead called the Eco Psychology Initiative. And the Eco Psychology Initiative is using the principles of nature and psychology to try and foster more healing and health and resilience. And so we have a lot of different classes and programs. Some
Mm,
are kind of training based, for example, like ecotherapy or climate psychology. Some are more like a monthly gathering where it's on a different subject of eco psychology, and we just all come together. So, for example, our last one is we had a guest speaker, a young Ecuadorian woman who was talking about using psychological biomimicry, what mycorrhizae can teach us about being
mm.
resilient in these turbulent times. And so, anyway, there's a lot of different programs and classes that we offer. And then there's also an opportunity to reach out to us if people are interested in working with me in a one-on-one capacity, whatever that might be like.
Awesome. That is so great. It sounds like a really great organization and doing a lot of really important stuff. Thank you again
Yeah, well,
so
thank
much
you.
for being on the podcast and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with our listeners.
It's a great honor, Michael. Thank you so very much.
Well, I really enjoyed that talk with Dennis. It was so filled with information. I'm not going to say much about it. You can go back, and I would encourage you to listen to it again because it's so dense. Just slow it down, pause it, look up some of the references and some of the techniques, and definitely check out the Eco Psychology Initiative. There's a really great resource for all sorts of materials and training programs and everything else to get involved more deeply into the subject. Um, I talked to him afterwards and asked him, I said, hey, as you know, on this podcast, we like to incorporate folk tales and myths and such. And so do you have anything you want to suggest? Any story that stands out that sort of incorporates some of the ideas you're talking about? So he thought about it and he came back to me and wanted me to read the Daedalus and Icarus myth. And I'll talk about it afterwards, why, but so I'm going to present that now to you. So this is the Daedalus and Icarus. On the island of Crete, there lived a minotaur, a ferocious creature that was half man and half bull. The people of the island of Crete were terrified of the minotaur. It loved nothing more than to feast on human flesh. They begged the ruler King Minos to order that the creature be killed, but the king decided against this. Instead, he constructed a plan to imprison the Minotaur. To die at the hands of the Minotaur would be one of the most terrible deaths imaginable, and King Minos believed that his enemies deserved to meet such a fate. He enlisted the help of Daedalus, a talented architect, inventor, and craftsman, and asked him to build a labyrinth, a maze of passages that would be so complex that it would be virtually impossible for anyone or anything to ever find a way out. Daedalus did as King Minos requested, and then, following the king's instructions, he entered the Minotaur into the labyrinth by leaving a huge pile. He enticed the Minotaur into the labyrinth by leaving a huge pile of fresh meat in its center. Once the Minotaur was in the labyrinth, the creature was unable to escape. King Minos was delighted. Anyone who was sent to the labyrinth would be trapped, and eventually they would be found by the Minotaur, who would eat them alive. Now he had the perfect punishment for his enemies. Deciding he had no further use for Daedalus, the king threw him into the labyrinth along with his son Icarus. The king expected that the inventor and his son would be found by the Minotaur and eaten. Instead, unknown to the king, they escaped. After all, Daedalus had built the labyrinth and knew his way around. Once out of the labyrinth, Daedalus and Icarus carefully made their way to the shore of the island and pondered on what to do next. The trees and bushes surrounding the beach would provide an ideal sanctuary for the time being. They could possibly survive for months or years without being seen. But who would want to live like that, hiding away hoping they would not be captured? They needed to find a way to leave the island. But how? They could not swim. The nearest land was too far away, and they would never make it. They could not leave by ship. All vessels were controlled by King Minos. Daedalus stared up at the sky and the seagulls that circled overhead. If only he was as free as a bird. If only he and his son could just fly away. And then he had an idea which was both brilliant and ambitious. He would build a pair of wings. It would take some time, days, weeks even, but he would build a pair of wings for himself and his son. Exactly the same type of wings that the seagull had, but on a much larger scale. Scattered around the beach were seagull feathers. Daedalus instructed his son to collect as many as he could find. He worked carefully to build the wings, studying the exact angle and shape of the seagulls and examining how the birds flew. At last, 6 weeks after they had escaped from the labyrinth, the wings were ready. "With these wings you will fly like a bird," Daedalus told his son. "But be careful. Make sure you do not fly too close to the sun. If you do, the wax that holds the feathers together will melt." Icarus nodded quickly. In truth, he was barely listening. Hiding on the shore of the island of Crete had been boring. He had spent weeks doing nothing more exciting with his days than collecting feathers and catching fish for his father and himself to eat. And now, at last, they had the chance to escape. He shuffled impatiently as his father attached the wings to his arms and then helped his father to position his own wings. We are ready," his father told him. "Follow me." Daedalus ran forwards towards the ocean, sweeping his arms up and down as he did so. With a whoosh, he zoomed forward, rising into the air. Icarus copied his father. Suddenly, he found his feet were no longer on the ground. He was in the air. He was flying. He couldn't believe it. As he looked down at the sea below, his heart fluttered with excitement. It was as though his body was weightless. The wind whistled against his ears. He felt like a bird. Higher and higher, faster and faster he flew. Suddenly, Icarus realized he could hardly see his father. He had flown so high, his father resembled a small dot below him. At the same time, he noticed a feather drift past and float downwards towards the sea. And then another, and then another. Too late, Icarus realized his wings were melting. He had flown too close to the sun with every desperate swoop of his arms. More feathers fell, and soon his arms were almost bare. Down, down, down went Icarus. "Father," he shouted before falling with a heavy splash into the sea. His few remaining feathers floated on the surface of the water and sank. Daedalus could only watch helplessly, and his heart felt as heavy as a stone as he flew onwards, leaving his son behind. So that's the story of Daedalus and Icarus. And Dennis pulled out that story because it involves biomimicry. So the notion of the way that we as humans can mimic the natural world and learn from the natural world. And this is literally done, but Dennis talks about how to do that psychologically. But he also wanted me to read this story because even though we're mimicking sort of the natural world and learning from it and adapting to it, there are certain restrictions built in to the natural world. And so there's this notion of hubris, human hubris, thinking that we can go beyond those limits, we can break them. And as many Greek tragedies show you, we break those rules at our peril. I think about, the notion of capitalism or consumerism, and that our economy is based on this grow or die notion, as if the earth was an unlimited resource, as if the earth itself was primarily a resource and not a living organism that needs to be tended to, we need to live in balance with it. When we break through and break out of these natural constraints, tragedy happens. And that's what we see now in the way humans are approaching the natural world, is we're living out of balance. And so it's about being in balance with nature and learning from nature and learning the wisdom of nature, which includes limitations, unfortunately. So tell me what you think. Maybe you drew something else from that story. Maybe there's more there. If so, let me know in the comments. And I'm so glad you were here today and that we shared the wisdom of Dennis Kiley and eco-psychology. And let me know what you think. And if you know someone who could use to hear about this episode and these ideas, please share this with them. All right, until next time. That's all for this episode of Resilience in Dark Times. Your action items? First, try one strategy we discussed. Second, connect with one person about these issues. Breaking isolation is resistance. And third, leave us a review to help others find this community. For show notes and resources, visit resilienceindarktimes.com. I'm Michael Glavin, reminding you that your resilience is revolutionary. See you next episode.